I stood there in my best dress, clutching a glass I could barely afford, when he curled his lip and called me trash right in front of his new shiny friends. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just felt something deep inside me harden into stone. And that was the day I decided he would regret ever forgetting the woman who once scrubbed toilets just so he could rise. Thank you for taking a moment to listen. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because stories like mine deserve to be heard in every corner. I gave that man my youth, my strength, and my quiet loyalty. Washing bathrooms through cold nights with a rag in one hand and his dreams in the other, I packed his meals, stitched his torn shirts, whispered that he would become something great, even when the world laughed at his big words and small pockets. I never once wished for diamonds or comfort. I only wanted to see pride in his eyes when he looked at the woman who lifted him from nothing. But success twisted him into someone I could no longer recognize. He straightened his tie and forgot the one who once ironed it. He learned new words and used them like weapons against my plain ones. Until finally at that party, in a room full of people who never knew our hunger, he threw away my love with a single cruel laugh. Still, I kept my face calm, watching every memory of my sacrifice flicker like dying candles, because I knew something that moment. That dignity is quiet until it decides to roar, and that I would not let the world remember me as the woman he disguised behind shame, but as the force he should never have betrayed. I remember the first time I met him. He was thin as a rain-soaked stray, but his eyes sparked with determination. He told me he wanted to become a lawyer, to fight for justice. And I believed him so fiercely, I didn't mind tying my apron strings tighter while taking every cleaning job I could find, scrubbing greasy tiles in restaurant kitchens, wiping lipstick smudges off office mirrors, and kneeling on bathroom floors while strangers stepped around me without a glance. All because I carried his future in my heart like a sacred promise. I thought one day he would stand in a courtroom, win his first big case, and reach for my hand to thank me. I dreamed of sitting in a simple wooden chair with pride shining in my wrinkles, whispering that every blister on my palms had been worth it. Every drop of sweat had built the foundation of his greatness. Instead, I watched him climb, higher and higher, until my face became a shadow behind him. I paid his tuition in cash, rolled tightly in my apron pocket. I skipped meals so he would never walk into class hungry. I walked home alone under flickering streetlights because he needed the car more than I needed rest. I stood behind him during every setback, whispering that he was born for greatness. I pinned his first tie and tucked a paper note in his jacket telling him not to fear the judges because I believed in him enough for both of us. I watched him pass the bar exam, tears filling my eyes as he gripped my hands with trembling excitement, promising that everything would change for us now. But it did not change for us. It changed for him. He got a job at a fancy firm where everyone spoke with smooth voices and shook hands too softly to ever know real work. He stopped telling people I cleaned offices. Instead, he said I stayed at home, which was a lie. Because even then, I was waking before dawn to wipe the mess others left behind. The more successful he became, the more he polished his story, erasing my name and replacing it with empty phrases like hard work and personal dedication. I started noticing he would wince whenever I laughed too loudly, or gently push my hand away if I reached to straighten his collar in public. As if my touch carried the smell of disinfectant he wanted buried forever. But I stayed quiet, swallowing every sting, telling myself that love sometimes wears uncomfortable shoes, and maybe I simply needed to walk longer in mine. I convinced myself that once he secured his spot at the very top, he would return to me with softness, with pride, with gratitude. Yet life has a cruel way of revealing truth, not all at once, but piece by piece, like slow poison. I heard him on the phone one evening, telling his colleague that he could not invite me to a company dinner because I would embarrass him with my background. I stood by the doorway, clutching a dish towel in my hand as each word cut deeper than any betrayal I could ever imagine. Still, I did not confront him. I told myself maybe I misheard. I cooked his favorite meal that night, placed it gently on the table, smiled when he barely looked up from his phone, and called me a good woman. But my heart cracked in silence, waiting for the day it would shatter completely. That day came sooner than I expected, because not long after I overheard those cruel words on the phone. He asked me to accompany him to a grand celebration hosted by his law firm. I stood in front of the mirror wearing a second-hand dress I stitched myself, smoothing the fabric over my tired body, telling my reflection that tonight he might finally acknowledge everything we had survived. When we arrived, the room was overflowing with glittering gowns, polished smiles, and glasses clinking with champagne I had only ever seen in advertisements. He barely introduced me to anyone. Rushing ahead, while I trailed behind, trying not to look lost among women who smelled of perfume worth more than my entire wardrobe. Halfway through the evening, he finally gestured toward me, calling out with a proud smirk that I was the woman who spent years cleaning toilets so he could become the man they were now applauding. Laughter erupted across the table like cruel thunder. I felt my cheeks burn as everyone turned to stare, some with pity but most with amusement, as though I were a punchline rather than a partner. I stood still, forcing my hands not to tremble, each laugh echoing the years I had scrubbed floors until my knees ached. I wanted to run, yet something inside me stayed firmly rooted. I watched his grin widen as he basked in their approval, not realizing that he had just severed the last fragile thread binding my loyalty to his ungrateful heart. On the drive home, he boasted about how well the night had gone, while I stared out the window, in numbed silence, counting streetlights like silent witnesses to my humiliation. When we pulled into our driveway, he turned to me and said, I should be grateful he had not left me behind entirely, that I was lucky to stand beside a man of his status. Those words flicked a switch deep in my spirit. I did not speak. I simply nodded, stepping out of the car slowly like a woman rising from her own grave. Inside the house, I folded my apron for the last time, no longer the woman who would bend and kneel for someone who viewed her sacrifice as dirt under his expensive shoes. I laid awake that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling every sacrifice return to me as a memory soaked in pain. And by morning, I decided that if he thought I was trash, then I would show him how dangerous trash can be when it is left to burn. I began my new morning with a silence he mistook for surrender, cooking his breakfast without a single word, placing his coffee on the table before he could complain, as I had done every day for over a decade. He ate quickly without truly seeing me, gathering his files and brushing past with a mumbled reminder that the divorce papers would arrive soon, because he believed we had grown apart. In truth, he had grown above while expecting me to stay beneath. When the door slammed behind him, I slipped off my old shoes and walked through our house, touching every object I had once bought with my hard-earned cleaning wages. I whispered my farewell to the walls that had held my tears during nights he never knew I cried. Then I retrieved every document I had carefully kept over the years. Receipts of tuition payments, bank transfers I made into his accounts, even the signed acknowledgement that our first shared property belonged equally to both of us. I tucked them neatly into a folder and walked to the one person he wished never to cross paths with. His rival, a seasoned lawyer named Richard Cole, a man he had always wanted to defeat but never did. I entered Richard's office expecting nothing more than legal advice. Yet the moment he saw the tired defiance in my eyes, he stood up slowly, offering me a chair with genuine respect. I told him everything. From the nights I washed sinks until my fingers split to the shameful moment I became my husband's joke. I expected pity, but instead, Richard looked at me with quiet admiration. He said powerful men often forget the pillars that lifted them to glory, and that my husband's greatest weakness was underestimating the woman who built his empire. He promised to help me claim everything that was legally mine. Not out of charity, but because he believed justice sometimes begins with small hands and large hearts. As we gathered documents together, I felt the steady return of something I thought I had lost forever: dignity. I left his office that day with my shoulders straighter and my spirit sharper, knowing that when my husband filed for divorce, thinking he would toss me aside without consequence, he had unknowingly opened a door that would lead to his own destruction. I went home and cooked dinner as usual so he would not suspect a thing, listening to him boast about a new trial victory while I stirred soup with calm hands. Inside my mind, I was already laying the foundation of a different kind of victory. One where I would take back not just his fortune, but every ounce of respect he had stripped from me. And I swore that when the moment came, I would not raise my voice. I would simply walk away, leaving him to crumble under the weight of my silence. Weeks passed quietly while Richard and I met in secret, collecting every fragile thread of evidence that proved I was not merely his wife, but the very foundation of his success. We traced tuition payments back to the cleaning companies that once paid me in crumpled bills. We uncovered property documents bearing my faded signature that he had hidden in filing cabinets with the intention of wiping me out of his story. Every time I handed Richard another piece of proof, he gave me a nod that felt like a metal pinned over my once weary heart. While at home, my husband remained oblivious, leaving early each morning dressed in tailored suits and returning late with the smell of expensive whiskey on his breath. He spoke of partners and clients, as though I could no longer understand the language of ambition. Sometimes he hinted that once the divorce was finalized, he would move nearer to the city and start a new life. I nodded politely while folding his polished shirts, knowing he would soon face a future far away from comfort. Finally, the day came when Richard told me we were ready. With careful timing, we filed our case on the same morning. My husband was meant to deliver a televised opening argument in one of the biggest trials of his career. He left our house believing everything around him was perfectly in place, not knowing that within hours the ground beneath his feet would split open as he stood before cameras and judges with confident swagger. Court officials arrived to serve him the legal notice of asset seizure, freezing his accounts, halting his access to properties, and placing a legal hold on every car, watch, and dollar that bore our shared history. I remained at home, sipping tea, watching him on television as shock took over his face when he realized he had been outmaneuvered by the one person he thought too simple, too meek, too forgettable to ever fight back. He stammered through his speech, his hands shaking, his eyes darting as whispers spread through the courtroom. Behind the cameras, people began to murmur that perhaps his perfect life had been built on something less glamorous than he had claimed. I did not feel joy, only a deep, calm satisfaction, because I knew that dignity does not always roar in anger. Sometimes it wraps itself around justice and watches patiently as the one who betrayed it falls from a height he believed was untouchable. The moment the court served those papers marked the true beginning of his downfall. Because, within hours, news outlets picked up the story that the rising legal star who had once boasted about building himself from the ground had in fact been funded by a woman he was now trying to discard. Journalists began digging, unearthing details he had buried for years. Articles appeared questioning his integrity. Clients called to withdraw their cases. Fearing their money was tangled in a scandal, I sat in my modest kitchen with curtains fluttering from a gentle breeze, stirring a pot of soup while listening to the radio speak his name with a tone that once sounded like praise, but now dripped with suspicion. Phone calls flooded his office. Reporters waited outside his firm's glass doors. He tried to control the narrative by denying everything, claiming I was just a woman he had helped out of pity. Yet the receipts, the dates, and the signatures all stood silently against him, like a wall. Even he could not argue down. Meanwhile, Richard moved with fierce precision, ensuring every asset tied to our marriage became locked behind legal iron gates until the court decided what belonged to whom. My husband arrived home that evening, looking like a man chased by ghosts, his shirt wrinkled, his hair wild, his arrogance visibly cracked. He demanded to know what I had done. I simply placed his favorite bowl of soup in front of him and said I had protected what was mine. He shouted that I was ruining everything he had worked for, that I was dragging his name through mud. I reminded him he was the one who had thrown me into that mud first. He stormed out of the house yelling that I would regret this. But as I closed the door behind him, I realized he was already regretting the very moment he thought he could rise by crushing the woman who once knelt to polish his shoes before he walked into every opportunity she created. The next day, he went to the bank only to find his cards declined. He visited his apartment in the city only to discover it locked under court order. Every corner he turned, he met another locked door, another whisper, another reminder that pride built on betrayal eventually collapses into dust. As his world unraveled, he tried desperately to claw back the respect he once commanded, calling his partners to assure them everything was under control. But they had already begun distancing themselves, fearing his downfall would stain their own reputations. He walked with shoulders hunched instead of proudly straight, every step weighted by the knowledge that the woman he once mocked had quietly toppled him, using nothing but truth and patience. I meanwhile found myself breathing easier than I had in years. I no longer woke before dawn to scrub other people's mess. Instead, I sat by my small window with a cup of warm tea, letting the morning sun reach my skin as though it too had been waiting to find me. Richard called often with updates, telling me how quickly my husband's clients were signing over their contracts to another firm, how whispers in the legal community now spoke of him not as a champion, but as a cautionary tale. I listened without spite in my heart, because revenge was never my aim. I only wanted to reclaim the dignity and security I had earned. When the day finally came to stand before the court for our divorce, hearing he entered with eyes dimmed from sleepless nights, his suit rumpled, his pride cracked, I stood straight wearing a simple dress and holding the folder of documents that had become my armor. He avoided my gaze until the judge asked if he had any objection to handing over half of everything we had built. His lips trembled, but he knew the law was stacked solidly against him. He nodded in defeat while I remained calm. Afterward, as we stepped outside, he reached for my arm, whispering that he never meant to hurt me the way he did, that he had simply lost himself in his career, and that perhaps we could talk. I gently pulled away, telling him there were some roads that once burned could never be rebuilt. His shoulders sagged as he realized the door to my heart was closed for good. He whispered that he understood and wished me happiness. I nodded and wished him peace. As he walked away from my gate slowly, I felt no bitterness, only a strong, gentle pride blooming in the place where humiliation had once lived. Because I finally understood that love does not mean sacrificing yourself until nothing remains. Love must also mean choosing yourself when someone refuses to choose you. And in that moment, I knew I had not only won justice, but reclaimed something far greater: my own voice. After the divorce was finalized, I used my share not to chase luxury, but to build a life I could truly call my own. I bought a small, cozy house on a quiet street, planted roses in the front yard even though my back still ached from the years I had spent on my knees cleaning other people's grime. I painted the walls myself, humming softly as each stroke felt like wiping away the memory of the woman who once doubted her worth. Richard helped me set up my finances so no one could ever make me feel powerless again. And though he never spoke of it directly, I could feel his protective respect surround me like a warm blanket. Sometimes he would visit on weekends, bringing simple gifts like fresh bread or a book he thought might interest me. He never asked for anything in return, only listened as I talked about my dreams I once buried, because I believed supporting someone else's journey was enough. During those quiet conversations, I discovered that my heart still knew how to beat with hope. Even after all the betrayal and humiliation, I began volunteering at a local school, helping children with reading, because education had once been the reason I believed in my husband. I found joy in watching young minds grow. And slowly I reconnected with the woman I had been long before marriage shaped me into someone else. Meanwhile, whispers of my ex-husband's fall drifted through town. He sold his expensive suits to pay small bills. His former friends crossed the street to avoid his desperate greetings. I heard he moved into a modest rental apartment, licking his wounds alone. Some said he tried to reconcile with a cousin for a loan, but the cousin refused, telling him that a man who forgets the source of his blessings cannot be trusted. I did not celebrate his misfortune, but neither did I pity him, because he had been given everything I had to offer, and he chose to throw it away with cruel laughter. Time passed, and one afternoon I found him standing at my gate, looking thinner than I remembered. His eyes were clouded with regret, and his voice trembled as he asked if we could talk. Part of me wanted to close the door, but another part of me remembered how much love I had once had for him. So I stepped outside and listened, as he said he was sorry, that he had let pride swallow his heart, that he missed the simple meals I cooked and the warmth of my quiet support. He asked if there was any chance I would let him back into my life. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the man I once loved, but a stranger carved by regret. I told him some mistakes carve scars too deep to heal, and while forgiveness is possible, returning to the past would only reopen wounds that had finally begun to close. His shoulders sagged again as he realized the door to my heart was closed for good. He whispered that he understood and wished me happiness. I nodded and wished him peace. As he walked away from my gate, slowly I felt no bitterness, only a strong, gentle pride blooming in the place where humiliation had once lived, because I finally understood that love does not mean sacrificing yourself until nothing remains. Love must also mean choosing yourself when someone refuses to choose you. And in that moment, I knew I had not only won justice, but reclaimed something far greater: my own voice. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding not just my surroundings, but the spirit inside me that had been worn down by years of silent sacrifice. I started each morning with a smile, opening my curtains to greet the sunlight as though I had never fully allowed myself to believe that it was never too late to choose myself, to start over, not in spite of the years lost, but because of them. Every wrinkle on my face had a story. Every scar on my hands, a chapter, and together they formed a book I had once been afraid to read aloud. Now I stood tall, not as someone who needed validation, but as someone who had found peace in the sound of her own footsteps, no longer rushing, no longer bending, just walking at her own steady pace. I still tend my roses every morning, and I still keep those old pay stubs and handwritten receipts. Not out of bitterness, but as quiet proof that even the smallest sacrifices build the tallest foundations when they come from love. Sometimes people ask me if I ever think about what could have been, and I smile because I know the answer is no. What could have been was never meant to last. What I have now is what was waiting for me all along. And if my story can teach anyone anything, it's that you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You just need to know when to stop listening to the ones who silence you. Thank you so much for staying with me through this journey. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe so we can keep sharing these truths together.